Have you ever stopped to notice how wars in the 20th century seem to hit old Tartarian city centers with almost eerie accuracy? It's not just that cities were bombed, it's that the very core took the hit, the ancient heart. The zones filled with massive stone buildings, towering doorways, oversized halls. Again and again, those places take a direct hit, like a target painted in advance. Look at the photos from before. Dense, packed centers, narrow streets, old squares, historic stations, early bridges, thick stone walls. Then look at the after images. The center is simply gone. No single street left, no blocks spared, entire neighborhoods wiped out, as if war itself were being used like an eraser. And here's the part that should really give you pause. When old city maps are laid over wartime damage maps, the worst destruction often falls exactly where the oldest and most unusual architecture was clustered. It repeats across countries, across armies, across decades. Same pattern. So what was it really? Just bad luck? Standard military strategy? Or something else entirely? Something that wasn't meant to remain once the smoke settled? Because after the bombs came the second wave. Reconstruction. New streets, new grids, new blueprints. And suddenly the city doesn't just look repaired, it looks rewritten. So ask yourself this. If this was only war, why does it keep striking the same kinds of places, producing the same kinds of outcomes? Why does it feel like the past itself was being singled out? I wasn't even searching for patterns when this started. I was deep in research on European architecture, 19th century train stations, old civic buildings, the usual academic rabbit holes that quietly consume whole weekends. Nothing strange, nothing suspicious, until I saw an overlay. Someone had placed a wartime damage map on top of an 1890 city plan of Dresden. The red zones, marking total destruction, lined up almost perfectly with the city's oldest quarter. Not the factories, not the rail yards on the outskirts, but the stone core, the monumental center. The areas with enormous doorways and cavernous halls supposedly built for far smaller populations. Then I checked another city. Warsaw, same method. Old map beneath, damage map above. And there it was again. The red zone chewing through the historic center like acid eating away a photograph. Coincidence, I told myself. Cities concentrate important buildings downtown. Bombs hit important targets. Simple wartime geometry, reasonable enough. But I kept going. Cologne, the ancient cathedral somehow still standing, while everything around it was flattened into a near-perfect ring. Rotterdam, the entire medieval core erased, while port facilities took relatively light damage. Coventry, the old walled city reduced to rubble, yet the outer industrial belt remained functional enough to keep producing. And this is where it started to bother me. These weren't precision strikes carried out with modern weapons. These were mass bombing raids, often at night, flying through clouds, using navigation systems that could miss by hundreds of meters, sometimes more. The historical record is clear about this. Bombing in the 1940s was not accurate. Crews aimed for general areas, not exact locations. So why do the destruction patterns look so exact? Look again at the before photos. What stands out? Crowded, ornate city centers. Buildings made from enormous stone blocks. Doorways rising 12 to 15 feet high. Staircases wide enough for 3 people to walk side by side. Windows sized for rooms with 18-foot ceilings. Architecture historians carefully describe as ceremonial, civic, or symbols of 19th century grandeur. Now look at the after images. Same street, same angle, same coordinates, and it's gone. Not damaged, not burned and rebuilt, Gone. The land scraped bare, ready for something new, something modern, something standardized. 8-foot ceilings, doors sized to fit the people now using them. I could dismiss the first city. The second made me curious. By the fifth, I was writing things down. By the 10th, I was actively searching for explanations that didn't rely on the word coincidence. Because when you strip away the excuses and just study the damage maps, something becomes hard to ignore. The hits don't scatter randomly, the way an accurate bombing should. They cluster, they concentrate. They keep finding the oldest, densest, strangest parts of urban cores, with a level of consistency the era supposedly couldn't achieve. Military historians do offer explanations. Rail hubs were often near city centers. Government buildings were strategic targets. Communication centers needed to be destroyed. All of that is true, and yet the pattern remains. All of this is on record. It's documented, but it still doesn't explain why the destruction so often spread far beyond those supposedly legitimate targets. It doesn't explain why entire residential districts disappeared. Old residential districts, stone housing blocks, homes built with oversized doors, oversized stairways, oversized everything. Gone. Meanwhile, industrial facilities sitting out on the edges of cities often survived. So pause for a second and ask yourself this. If your real goal was to cripple a nation's ability to wage war, would you aim for factories or would you aim for architecture? And yet, once the smoke cleared and the maps were redrawn, it wasn't factories that vanished from city layouts. It was the old quarters, the stone quarters, the parts of European cities that looked nothing like the mid-20th century, and even less like what came after. I kept staring at those overlays. Old map, damage map, old map, damage map, over and over. And the pattern didn't break. It crossed borders. It crossed years. It crossed opposing armies that supposedly shared nothing except the desire to destroy one another. Whatever struck these cities struck the same kinds of places every time, every single time. That phrase kept looping in my head when I finally pulled up a proper overlay, the kind done carefully by someone who knew what they were doing. A historical map geo-referenced, coordinates aligned, destruction data layered on top with precision. Dresden, 1892. A city plan drawn when the old quarters still existed in full density. Tight streets radiating from central squares. Stone buildings packed shoulder to shoulder. Irregular footprints shaped by centuries of use, not by clean modern grids. The Altstadt, the old city, stood out clearly. A heavy architectural mass, distinct from the newer rings expanding outward. Now switched to the damage overlay from February 1945. The red zone marking total destruction doesn't spread evenly. It doesn't resemble the messy scatter you'd expect from bombs dropped through clouds, smoke, and anti-aircraft fire. It sits there. It concentrates. It finds the Altstadt the way a hand reaches automatically into a familiar pocket. The standard explanation appears almost immediately in every source. Dresden was a transportation hub. Multiple rail lines converged there. The old city held government offices, communication centers, military administration, legitimate targets. I accepted that explanation for about an hour. Then I started measuring. The rail yards were mostly north and west of the historic center. Major industrial sites, optics factories, armaments works sat farther out. Communication infrastructure wasn't confined to one tight cluster either. It stretched across the wider city. But the firestorm that swallowed Dresden in February 1945 didn't behave like a focused strike on a handful of targets. The bombers arrived in waves. First came high explosives to rip open roofs and walls, then incendiaries to ignite what was exposed, then more incendiaries to feed the growing blaze. This was standard doctrine for the time. Nothing unusual in the technique itself. What stood out was the shape it left behind. The firestorm consumed roughly 1,600 acres of the city center. The heat burned so intensely that stone itself altered, calcified, warped, became brittle. Winds formed powerful enough to knock people off their feet and pull them toward the flames. It erased not just buildings, but streets, foundations, even the clear evidence that anything had ever stood there. When the fires finally burned out, Dresden's medieval core was simply gone. Baroque layers vanished, Renaissance palaces reduced to ash. What remained were the suburbs, the industrial zones, and a few structures clinging to the very edge of the destruction, survivors spared by mere meters. And this is where things get uncomfortable. Dresden's bombing has been analyzed for decades. Historians debate casualty numbers, military necessity, moral responsibility. But almost no one asks the simplest cartographic question, the one that jumps out in seconds if you actually look. Why does the destruction zone align so closely with the boundary of the old city? Look at the overlay again. The red zone barely spills into 19th century developments. It doesn't push deep into the industrial belt. It lands on the oldest architecture with what, on a map, looks disturbingly like intent. Inaccurate bombing should leave chaos, scatter, uneven damage, random gaps and overlaps shaped by chance, wind, and the confusion of night raids. But that's not what these maps show. But that's not what the Dresden overlay actually shows. It shows a bullseye. And that bullseye sits exactly where the oldest, strangest, most oversized architecture once stood. I needed a second example. Different country, different combatants, different objectives. If the pattern held, coincidence became much harder to defend. If it didn't, I could shut the laptop and go back to ordinary research. So I opened Warsaw. Different war, different army, different ideology. And yet the method worked the same way. An 1880 city plan aligned with a 1944 damage assessment. And there it was again. The red zone locking onto the Stare Miasto, the old town, with that same unsettling precision, the same dense stone core, the same concentration of destruction. The Germans didn't just bomb Warsaw. After the uprising, they dismantled it deliberately, building by building, block by block, a slower, colder form of destruction than Dresden, but with the same final result. The old city, the stone city, the one with tall doors and massive halls, reduced to foundations. 2 wars, 2 armies, 2 methods, same pattern, same type of target, same outcome. I opened a 3rd city, then a 4th. Then I stopped counting and started documenting, because the pattern wasn't weakening. It was intensifying. Each overlay added weight to something I didn't want to see. Dresden could be explained away. Warsaw could be rationalized. But by the 5th, 6th, 7th city, the explanation started requiring more effort than the pattern itself. Rotterdam, May 1940. The Luftwaffe bombed the city center for about 15 minutes. 15 minutes. That's all it took to erase 9 centuries of accumulated architecture. The medieval core, the part tourists would have photographed, the canal houses, stone churches, merchant halls with oversized doorways vanished in a quarter of an hour. The port, however, remained operational. And that matters. Rotterdam was one of the largest ports on Earth. If the goal had been to crush Dutch resistance quickly, Destroying harbor infrastructure would have done it. Instead, the bombers targeted the city center. The old city center. The part that, on paper, had little to do with shipping capacity or direct military logistics. The official explanation is straightforward. The bombing aimed to force Dutch surrender. Terror bombing. Break civilian morale by destroying civilian space. And maybe that's true. Maybe medieval churches and Renaissance guild halls were destroyed simply to shock and intimidate. Nothing more. Maybe there's no deeper pattern here at all. But then why does the same footprint appear in cities bombed by the Allies? Cologne. British and American forces bombed it again and again. More than 200 air raids. The destruction became so complete that post-war photos show the cathedral standing alone in a sea of rubble. The only vertical structure visible for blocks in every direction. The cathedral survived. Everything around it didn't. And what was everything around it? The Altstadt. The old city, Roman foundations, medieval street layouts, buildings that had stood for centuries, structures with proportions that feel off, doors and halls that seem scaled for bodies larger than the ones walking through them in the 20th century. Gone. All of it. And within 2 decades, much of it was replaced with modern buildings, modern proportions, modern explanations, making the older layer harder to even picture. I kept looking for a city that would break the pattern. A European city where the old quarter survived while industrial zones burned. Somewhere inaccurate bombing produced the scattered, chaotic destruction that inaccurate bombing should produce. I'm still looking. Coventry. The medieval center destroyed. The automotive factories damaged but repairable. Hamburg. The firestorm consumed dense historic quarters, while the U-boat pens, the actual strategic target, remained such a problem that entirely new weapons had to be developed because conventional bombing couldn't reliably destroy them. Würzburg. Roughly 90% of the historic center destroyed in 17 minutes. A city with no major war industry. A city whose surface value lay almost entirely in its Baroque architecture and its prince-bishop's residence. Halls and doorways that don't make sense if you imagine the normal-sized lives they were supposedly built to serve. The pattern wouldn't break, and it wasn't confined to Germany. It wasn't limited to Allied campaigns. Stalingrad. The old city center, built before Soviet standardization, annihilated. Meanwhile, the tractor factory producing tanks remained contested ground precisely because it still stood and still mattered. Kiev. The historic Khreshchatyk destroyed not by aerial bombing, but by demolition charges after German occupation began. Different tools. Same outcome. The official account says the buildings were booby-trapped by retreating forces, but eyewitnesses described explosions continuing for days, moving methodically through the oldest structures in ways that felt organized, almost deliberate, while newer Soviet-era buildings often remained standing. Different wars, different armies, different ideologies, different tools, same kinds of targets, same kinds of outcomes. That's when I started keeping a list. Cities where the old center suffered far more destruction than industrial zones or military infrastructure. Cities where the strangest architecture vanished. The oversized proportions. The massive stone construction. The features that don't sit comfortably inside the tidy story of recent origins. Gone. While newer buildings, simpler buildings, had a better chance of surviving. The list didn't slow down. It crossed borders and decades. It included enemies who later became allies, and allies who later turned on each other. And what it suggested couldn't be explained by any single bombing campaign. Whatever was being removed didn't look accidental, and whatever replaced it followed a pattern that felt less like organic rebuilding and more like a managed rewrite. One word kept showing up in my notes. I underlined it again and again. Erasure. Not damage. Not destruction. Erasure. As if the objective wasn't only to win wars, but to delete something, to remove it from the historical record itself. That idea wouldn't leave me alone as I started focusing on what exactly had been erased. Not just buildings, not just neighborhoods, a specific type of construction, a specific architectural language that appears across countries and cultures with a consistency that feels off. I have to describe it carefully, because once you notice it, it's impossible to unsee. Start with the doors. Not the grand ceremonial entrances meant to impress visitors. I mean everyday doors, interior doors, corridor doors, doors in offices, residences, back hallways where grandeur serves no obvious purpose. These doors rise 12 to 15 feet high. The handles sit closer to shoulder height for a modern adult. Their proportions feel wrong, like they were designed for users larger than the people we're told lived and worked in these spaces during the 18th and 19th centuries. Then look at the windows. Same story. Sills set higher than expected. Openings stretching upward toward ceilings 18, 20, sometimes even 25 feet high in rooms described in records as ordinary. Glass panes and frames scaled for spaces that visually dwarf the supposed daily life inside them. The staircases follow the same logic, treads deeper than modern comfort standards recommend. Risers that subtly change your gait. Less of a step, more of a long stride. Handrails positioned for hands reaching from greater height. Stair widths wide enough for 3, sometimes 4 people, to walk side by side in buildings supposedly built for smaller populations than those living today. Then there's the stonework. This is where it becomes much harder to dismiss. Enormous stone blocks fitted together with a precision modern engineers can replicate, but not cheaply, not quickly, and not without heavy machinery. Foundations sinking deeper than the structures above seem to require. Walls thicker than climate control or defense would normally justify. A style that signals permanence measured in centuries, not decades. This look has picked up a name in some circles. They call it Tartarian. The word itself is controversial. It appears on old maps, Tartaria, Grande Tartari, as a label for vast regions across Eurasia. What mapmakers meant by it is still debated. A political entity, a geographic region, a civilization, or simply a placeholder used by outsiders who didn't know what else to write. I'm not trying to resolve that debate. The label matters less than what it points toward, because whether you call it Tartarian, imperial, ceremonial, or old civic architecture, these buildings share traits that don't align neatly with their assigned origin stories. They look too advanced for some of the dates attached to them. They use techniques later builders struggled to reproduce during expansions or repairs, and they exist in quantities and layouts that resemble infrastructure more than isolated monuments. Then comes the detail that ties everything together. These structures cluster in the exact zones 20th century wars erased with such unsettling accuracy. Go back to the overlays. Dresden's Altstadt, Warsaw's Stare Miasto, Rotterdam's medieval core, Cologne's cathedral quarter. The red zones don't just mark destruction. They often trace the removal of a specific architectural type. Tall doors, oversized proportions, heavy stone construction that doesn't fit the simple story of ordinary people building ordinary spaces for people exactly like us. That's what disappeared. This is what the firestorms consumed. This is what methodical demolitions wiped away, and what post-war rebuilding quietly replaced with concrete, glass, steel, and standardized 8-foot ceilings. Coincidence only works if destruction is random. But what I kept seeing wasn't random at all. It was structured. The same pattern repeating across different wars, different armies, different stated goals, all aimed at buildings that felt like they belonged to someone else. Architecture that asks uncomfortable questions just by existing. Who built this? When? And why do the proportions seem to assume occupants we're never told about? That's when I started collecting images of what survived. Fragments at the edges of blast zones, lone buildings spared by meters, basements and foundations exposed after everything above them was stripped away. And the survivors tell the same story as the ruins. The scale doesn't fit the narrative. The craftsmanship exceeds what the official record makes seem reasonable. The proportions hint at inhabitants who weren't average, and maybe weren't uncommon either. And over decades, across borders, across opposing ideologies, someone made sure most of that evidence burned. Not all of it. They couldn't erase everything, but enough. Enough to make the questions harder to ask. Enough to make the pattern easy to dismiss. Enough to make you sound unreasonable for noticing what old photographs still show. That's exactly why most people don't look closer. The pattern hides in plain sight, because recognizing it forces questions that sound absurd until you line everything up and really look. Questions that stretch beyond one war, beyond one country, beyond a single tragic anomaly. Questions that link enemies who supposedly shared nothing except the desire to win. That's when it hit me. I'd been thinking too narrowly. Dresden, Warsaw, Rotterdam, Cologne, those belonged to World War II, the great inferno of the 20th century. The conflict that reshaped Europe and made mass destruction feel justifiable as military necessity. It's easy to file everything under total war and move on. But the pattern didn't begin in 1939, and it didn't stop in 1945. Go back earlier. World War I. Ypres. The medieval Cloth Hall, one of the largest commercial buildings of the Middle Ages, a structure whose scale never quite made sense for trade alone, reduced to rubble by artillery. Reconstruction took decades and followed the old plans, but the original was gone. Whatever its measurements hinted at, whatever its stonework could have revealed, survived only in photographs and drawings. Leuven. The university library burned in 1914, deliberately set on fire by German troops. 25,000 books vanished, along with the building that held them. A building with the same oversized proportions, the same heavy stone language, the same architectural vocabulary that would later burn across Europe. Rheims Cathedral shelled repeatedly. The explanation says German forces targeted it because French observers may have used the towers. Maybe. But the shape of the story repeats. The oldest, strangest, most anomalous structures draw fire, while obvious strategic targets remain contested, damaged, repaired, damaged again. Now move forward past 1945, into the Cold War and beyond. Post-war rebuilding didn't just fix damage. It redesigned cities from scratch. Urban planners arrived with visions of a new world. Wide roads for cars, standardized housing blocks, commercial districts built around efficiency and clean geometry. And the rubble of old cities made that easy. No long preservation battles. No heritage debates slowing things down. No awkward questions about buildings that didn't match their own paperwork. Just cleared land, displaced populations, and pressure to build fast. In Warsaw, they rebuilt the old town from photographs and paintings. A replica, a careful facsimile. But the original stones, the original foundations, the physical evidence of whoever built the first version, were gone. hauled away as rubble, recycled into new concrete, buried beneath modern blocks that would never raise the same uncomfortable questions the old structures asked simply by standing there. In Dresden, the Frauenkirche sat for decades as a heap of blackened stone. The East German government left it that way, if standing is even the right word, as a memorial to the war. Only after reunification did reconstruction begin. New materials, new methods, a structure that looks like the original, but no longer carries the same physical fingerprints in its stone. In Coventry, they chose a different gesture. A new cathedral rose beside the ruins of the old one, modern lines next to medieval remains. A public declaration about moving forward, about refusing to be trapped by loss. And that rhythm keeps repeating. Forward, 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 new plans, new proportions, new explanations. The old evidence replaced with replicas, memorials, and tidy narratives that never require anyone to ask why certain buildings looked the way they did in the first place. Then I noticed something else. This kind of clearing didn't happen only during declared wars. Chicago, 1871. The Great Fire. The story everyone remembers involves a cow and a lantern. Whatever the cause, the outcome was real. The central city was wiped out, including buildings that early photographs show with those same strange proportions. Oversized doors, heavy stonework, a scale that feels wrong for a young American city. San Francisco, 1906, earthquake and fire. Destruction concentrated in the oldest districts. Rebuilding was fast, modern, practical, and the architectural anomalies visible in pre-disaster images mostly vanish from the city that replaces them. Now the pattern stretches beyond wars, beyond formal conflicts, into disasters that just happen to erase the same kind of evidence in the same kinds of places, again and again. One war can be explained as military necessity. One disaster can be dismissed as bad luck. But a century of destruction, across continents, with different causes and different official explanations, all removing the same architectural vocabulary, all hollowing out the same kind of old core. That doesn't feel accidental. That feels like a pattern waiting for someone willing to name it. Still, before naming anything, I have to be honest about what the evidence actually supports. Because there are real explanations for why city centers burned. Explanations that don't require conspiracies, coordination, or uncomfortable ideas about forgotten civilizations. The pattern deserves to be tested against the strongest objections. Start with geography. 19th century cities grew outward from their centers. Rail lines converged downtown because that's where people and freight needed to go. Government buildings clustered in historic cores because that's where power had always been exercised. Communication infrastructure, telegraph offices, telephone exchanges, postal hubs sat centrally for the same reasons they do today. When military planners selected targets, they chose city centers not because of architecture, but because of function. That explains a large share of the destruction. Rail yards needed to be disabled. Command centers had to be neutralized. Communication networks required disruption. And all of those legitimate targets occupied the same zones where the oldest, strangest buildings stood. Correlation, not causation. The old architecture burned because it happened to sit on strategically valuable land. Nothing more. Then add the limits of technology. Bombing in the 1940s wasn't precise. Crews navigated by dead reckoning, radio beams, and visual cues when weather allowed. Bombers aimed at general areas, not exact coordinates. A successful mission meant landing bombs somewhere within a wide radius of the target. Under those conditions, bombs scattered. They fell on homes, churches, schools, anything surrounding the intended objective. The destruction of historic centers wasn't deliberate targeting, it was spillover, collateral damage on a massive scale. Firestorms followed their own rules. Once ignited, they spread according to wind, density, and fuel. They didn't distinguish between military infrastructure and medieval masonry. They burned whatever could burn. This explains even more. Old quarters were dense. Buildings pressed together along narrow streets. Perfect conditions for fires to leap from roof to roof, for isolated blazes to merge into something unstoppable, for entire neighborhoods to disappear in hours. Geography, technology, physics. Three explanations that don't require hidden coordination. Three reasons why the overlays might look the way they do without invoking a deliberate erasure of inconvenient evidence. I wanted those explanations to be enough. I wanted to shut the folders, close the tabs, and go back to ordinary research. To accept the simple logic that wars destroy cities, city centers hold old buildings, and therefore old buildings get destroyed. Clean, logical, finished. But the explanations kept leaking. If rail yards were the real targets, why were they so often spared? City after city, the stations survived while the neighborhoods around them turned to ash. Dresden's main station stood damaged but usable while the Altstadt was gone. If communication infrastructure was the priority, why did the destruction spread far beyond telephone exchanges and telegraph offices? The blast radii exceeded anything that looks like targeted disruption. And if firestorms spread according to physics alone, why did they so often stop at boundaries between old construction and newer development? On the overlays, the burn zones don't taper off. They end. Often right where 18th century architecture gives way to 19th century expansion. And if technological limits should produce messy, inaccurate results, why do the damage patterns look so clean? Random scatter should make random shapes. These shapes have edges, they have borders, they have definition. The standard explanations account for maybe 60 or 70% of what the maps show. They explain why city centers suffered. They explain why old quarters burned. They don't explain the precision. They don't explain the consistency across wars, armies, technologies, and decades. They don't explain why the same pattern appears in cities with no real strategic value at all. University towns, cultural centers, places whose only military significance was being in the way of armies that could have marched around them. The explanations are necessary, but they aren't sufficient. They describe what happened without explaining why it kept happening to the same kinds of places in the same kinds of ways. Something else was operating alongside military logic, something the official histories don't really address. And what bothered me most was this. It isn't hidden. The anomalies aren't locked away in classified archives or buried by authorities. They sit in public photographs, published damage maps, accessible city plans. Anyone can see them. Almost no one does. Take the targeting of civic buildings with no military function. Town halls, market squares, municipal theaters, public libraries, structures whose only strategic value was symbolic. Terror bombing, historians say. Break morale by erasing shared spaces, make people feel exposed by destroying landmarks. That explanation works right up until you notice which civilian landmarks were erased most thoroughly. Not 19th century department stores. Not modern municipal buildings built shortly before the wars. It's the old ones. The stone ones. The buildings with strange proportions. With construction techniques that shouldn't have been practical. With doors sized for occupants larger than their documented users. Freiburg's medieval center, destroyed in 1944 by Allied bombers who reportedly mistook it for another city entirely. A navigation error. According to official accounts, the bombs fell 25 kilometers from their intended target. 25 kilometers is a massive miss, even by 1940s standards, and yet the destruction was complete. The old city burned. The strange architecture vanished. Post-war rebuilding produced a modern center with standard proportions and no lingering questions. Würzburg, a city with almost no war industry, a place whose main value was cultural and architectural. Bombed in March 1945, weeks before Germany's surrender, when the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. Why spend scarce resources destroying a city that posed no strategic threat in the final days of the conflict? The official answer is simple: target availability. Other objectives were hidden by weather. Würzburg was visible. Würzburg burned. But what burned? The residence. The Prince Bishop's palace, with halls scaled like they were meant for giants, with doorways that make a mockery of the proportions attributed to its 18th century patrons. The Old Town. The medieval street plan. Buildings that predated their assigned construction dates in ways their own materials quietly reveal. And once you see that, it becomes harder to look away. Over 90% of the historic center gone in just 17 minutes. I keep circling back to details like this. Not the broad, obvious pattern everyone can see, but the specific choices that make no sense unless the pattern itself is intentional. Why bomb Lübeck in 1942, a medieval trading hub with barely any war industry, a UNESCO-caliber site before UNESCO even existed? Why hit Bath during the Baker raids, a Georgian spa town with precisely zero military value, whose destruction served no purpose other than erasing its architecture? Why systematically demolish Mont Saint-Michel, one of the oldest monasteries in Western Christianity, when the Germans weren't even using it for military operations? Post-war studies confirmed the monastery was unoccupied when Allied bombs reduced it to rubble. The official explanations pile up: terror tactics, navigation errors, target availability, miscommunication between ground forces and air command. Each one addresses a single incident. None of them accounts for the pattern: the recurring targeting of old architecture, the systematic erasure of the same kind of evidence. The pattern reads less like war and more like demolition with military cover. That realization led me to start compiling what I called mirror moments, instances where cities in different countries suffered destruction so similar that the photos could be swapped and no one would notice. The images speak for themselves. Before and after, the same three-beat rhythm plays across borders and decades. Gdansk, Poland, the Hanseatic trading center with merchant houses, Gothic churches, and streets far too narrow for artillery. Before, dense stone architecture, oversized doorways. Damage: 90% of the historic center obliterated in 1945. After, facades rebuilt, structural anomalies erased. Nuremberg, Germany, the medieval walled city largely intact into the 20th century. Stone foundations older than their assigned dates. Damage: Allied bombing destroyed the old town almost completely in January 1945. After, careful reconstruction looks medieval but contains none of the original materials. Minsk, Belarus. Virtually nothing predating the war survives. Before, Tartarian proportions, oversized civic architecture. Damage: 80% of buildings destroyed. After, Soviet reconstruction erased the old city plan entirely. The pattern keeps multiplying. A castle, Baroque palaces, medieval quarters, over 90% destroyed in a single raid, reconstructed with modern materials. Hildesheim. Medieval market square wiped out in March 1945. Rebuilt as replicas with nothing original. England. Plymouth's medieval Barbican. Destroyed during the Blitz. Modern reconstruction erased the pre-war street plan. Bristol, old shopping district with half-timbered buildings gone in November 1940, replaced by modern structures. The pattern even reaches Japan. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe. Before, Meiji-era architecture with the same anomalous proportions, stone foundations, oversized doorways, construction that doesn't match the official timeline. Damage. Firebombing wiped out historic centers. After, modern reconstruction left no physical connection to what stood before. I lined up the photographs. Before, damage, after. Across continents, decades, and different causes, the sequence repeats. Each time, the same architectural language disappears, replaced by something modern, standardized, and unremarkable. The mirror moments stack one on top of the other, and the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Dozens of cities, hundreds of photographs, and the same story repeating itself. Dense, ornate, anomalous city centers. Destruction focused almost entirely on the oldest quarters. Then modern reconstruction that wipes away every physical trace of what came before. Different architects, different armies, different declared goals. Yet the outcome stays the same. Identical targets, identical results. The same architectural language systematically erased. At some point, calling this coincidence stops being reasonable and starts sounding like an insult to the evidence. Something was being removed from the built environment. Something that appeared across cultures, across continents. Something that someone, or many someones, working with similar priorities, wanted gone. The mirror moments don't prove coordination. They don't prove conspiracy. But they do prove pattern. They prove consistency. And they prove that any real explanation has to account for repetition on a global scale. That part can't be waved away. But the bombs were only the first blow. What followed, reconstruction, urban renewal, modernization, delivered the second. And in many ways, that second strike was more complete than the first. Bombs leave rubble. Rubble can be examined. Foundations remain. Basements survive. Archaeological traces persist underground, waiting for someone curious enough to dig. The rebuilding ensured no one ever would. Look at what happened right after the wars. Across Europe, across Japan, across every bombed theater, the same sequence played out. Emergency housing first. Temporary structures on cleared land. Then permanent construction. But not on old foundations. Not along old street lines. Not preserving anything that might raise uncomfortable questions about what once stood there. Even the rubble became useful. Medieval stone crushed and poured into the foundations of modern apartment blocks. Fragments of Tartarian architecture buried beneath highways and parking lots. Evidence recycled into the bones of a new world that would never remember the old one. In Berlin, the Trümmerfrauen cleared an estimated 400 million cubic meters of debris. Where did it all go? Into the Teufelsberg, an artificial hill built from the ruins of the city itself, a literal burial mound for architecture that once didn't quite fit the official story. Urban planners followed with blueprints that had nothing to do with what had existed before. Narrow medieval streets replaced by wide boulevards, irregular building footprints erased by standardized housing blocks, modern civic centers, 8-foot ceilings, human-scale doorways, laid directly over foundations built for someone else, and people accepted it. They didn't really have a choice. The housing crisis was brutal. Millions were displaced. Shelter was urgent. Asking questions about preservation felt obscene when families were living in cellars and bomb craters. The urgency was real. The suffering was real. The need to rebuild quickly was genuine. But the specific solutions chosen from countless possible ones, consistently erased every physical link to the pre-war city. Streets were widened when widening wasn't necessary. Building lines were redrawn, even when the originals were still visible. Foundations were demolished, even when they could have supported new construction. The old cities didn't just burn, they were unbuilt, systematically, deliberately, with the same consistency that defined their destruction, and the records followed the buildings into oblivion. City archives burned, property registries vanished, construction documents disappeared during routine transfers to temporary storage. Original plans showing who built what, when, and how were simply gone. What emerged was a built environment with no memory. Cities that looked modern because they truly were modern. Architecture that asked no questions because it had existed for decades, not centuries. The second hit finished what the bombs started. Not damage, not destruction, erasure. A removal so complete that questioning it now sounds paranoid. And that's the most elegant part of it, if it was an operation at all. The erasure was so thorough that the eraser itself vanished. Still, I have to be honest about what I found when I went looking for contradictions. Any pattern that collapses under scrutiny isn't worth defending, and the archives do contain documents that challenge this entire line of thought. I found the target lists, not speculation, not interpretation, but the actual planning documents from Allied bomber commands. Directives spelling out which cities would burn and why. And they don't mention architecture. They don't reference anomalous proportions, strange construction, or the removal of inconvenient evidence at all. Exactly. The pieces start to fall into a different kind of logic. Not one of secret cabals, coded directives, or shadowy erasers, but one of opportunity and incentive. War, fire, earthquake, disaster. They're chaotic, destructive, imprecise. They don't need a hand selecting oversized doors or anomalous stonework. They only need to remove the friction. The friction of old streets, awkward foundations, heritage laws, civic pride, and inconvenient proportions that slow down planners, developers, and administrators. Then the market, the bureaucracy, and the practicalities of rebuilding step in. Cleared land is valuable. The old street patterns are inconvenient for modern traffic. Foundations too deep, walls too thick, proportions too odd to retrofit cheaply. The forces that already benefit from clearing, developers, urban planners, industrial interests, governments, move quickly. They standardize, they modernize, they rebuild in the style of efficiency and scale they understand. What looks like precision in destruction is really a two-step process. First, chaotic destruction that removes friction, and second, deliberate exploitation that ensures the old doesn't return. The pattern isn't orchestrated by bombs alone. It emerges because disasters disproportionately remove the oldest, densest, and most awkward parts of the urban fabric. The parts that happen to correspond with what we've been calling Tartarian architecture. And then human systems step in to make those spaces functional, profitable, and modern. You don't need a conspiracy to explain the repetition. You only need destruction, imprecise, chaotic, indifferent, incentive, a ready class of actors who gain when land, buildings, or infrastructure are removed. Implementation, bureaucracy, finance, and development machinery that turn rubble into something new. The overlay maps, the photographs, the mirror moments, they're all real. But they don't require an invisible hand plotting across centuries. They reveal the dynamics of opportunity and reconstruction, magnified by the fact that old, oversized, anomalous architecture is precisely the architecture that gets in the way of modern utility and profit. It's accidental, in the sense that no one set out with a map marking Tartarian building, destroy first. But it's inevitable, in the sense that the forces exploiting cleared space always converge on the same kind of urban friction. In other words, the pattern isn't magic, it's incentive realized at scale. And that, in its own way, is just as elegant and just as ruthless as any intentional erasure. There's a quiet danger here, and it isn't the one people usually point at. The danger isn't that you've uncovered a hidden lost civilization and no one else is brave enough to say it out loud. The danger is subtler and more interesting. It's that once you train your eye to see pattern, the pattern starts pulling gravity toward itself. It wants to become explanation. It wants to harden into certainty. And the built world is especially good at feeding that instinct, because it's full of discontinuities that feel personal when you notice them. Old stone does that to people. Let me slow the frame just a bit, not to dismiss what you're seeing, but to keep it from running ahead of what the evidence can actually carry. First, you're absolutely right about the reset mechanism. War, fire, disaster, redevelopment, these are selection events. They don't erase evenly. They preferentially remove density, irregularity, and anything expensive to adapt. Thick walls, non-standard spans, deep foundations, awkward footprints. The very things that make old buildings feel wrong to modern eyes are the things modern systems are least able or least willing to keep. That alone explains why what survives often feels anomalous. Survivorship bias doesn't produce averages, it produces weird leftovers. Second, proportions lie less than stories, but they still lie sometimes, just not in the way we expect. A 14-foot basement ceiling doesn't require giants. It requires cargo, or airflow, or flood mitigation, or thermal buffering, or public access in a different regulatory regime, or reuse layered on reuse. Medieval and early modern builders routinely overbuilt below grade because stone was cheap, labor was abundant, and future loads were unknown. Modern builders underbuild because every extra centimeter costs money and code compliance. What feels too big to us is often just pre-optimization architecture, built before anyone agreed on what enough was. Third, and this matters, the timeline problem cuts both ways. When materials analysis suggests stone predates the founding of a town, that doesn't necessarily mean a forgotten civilization. It often means the founding date is political, not archaeological. Charters are not origins, they're paperwork milestones. Settlements almost always predate the document that claims to start them, sometimes by centuries, sometimes by millennia. Bureaucracy is terrible at remembering anything that doesn't serve administration. So yes, something was here before, almost everywhere. But before doesn't automatically mean other in the way your pattern is beginning to imply. Here's where I think your strongest insight actually lives, and it's sharper without Tartaria. What's being erased isn't evidence of giants. It's evidence of non-industrial ways of building cities, cities that grew incrementally. That didn't optimize for cars, zoning, fire codes, HVAC, financial instruments, or standardized human bodies. Cities built by rules we no longer use, for lives we no longer organize the same way. When those cities burn, the replacement can't help but feel alien to what came before, because it is. And when you walk into a basement that feels wrong, what you're often feeling is not, "This was built for someone bigger," but "This was built for a world with different assumptions, different labor economics, different climate adaptation, different legal regimes, different relationships between public and private space." Those differences collapse into a single sensation: unease. The systems really do benefit from forgetting that. Not because there's a secret to hide, but because remembering complicates everything. It complicates ownership. It complicates planning. It complicates profit. Forgetting is cheaper. So yes, what happened wasn't an event. It was a process. And yes, it's still operating. Not to erase a lost civilization, but to erase alternatives. Proof that cities don't have to be shaped the way ours are now. Proof that standards are historical accidents, not inevitabilities. That's the threat old architecture poses. Not that it proves giants walked here once, but that it proves we've lived differently before and could again. And systems that run on efficiency, predictability, and growth don't like that reminder at all. Something left marks that fire couldn't fully erase, that demolition couldn't completely finish, that time couldn't quite bury. And when you put what survived next to what was destroyed, the pattern sharpens instead of fading. They didn't remove everything. They couldn't. And what remains is already enough to provoke questions someone clearly hoped would never be asked. Enough, at least, to make the silence around those questions feel intentional. But before pushing further, I have to confront the word I've been circling this whole time. The word that makes academics tense up. The word that gets people dismissed before they've even finished laying out their evidence. Tartaria. It shows up on maps. That part isn't controversial. European cartographers from the 16th through the 19th centuries labeled enormous stretches of Eurasia with that name. Tartaria Magna, Grande Tartari, Independent Tartari, Chinese Tartari. Those maps exist. They sit in archives. Anyone can look at them. They aren't forgeries. Where certainty ends is in what those mapmakers meant. The mainstream view is familiar. Tartaria was a vague geographic label, a catch-all for regions Europeans didn't understand well, much like the Orient once lumped together half the world without implying a single culture or state. The alternative reading is far more charged, that Tartaria referred to a real political or cultural entity, perhaps even a civilization whose architecture matches what I've been documenting, and whose disappearance from history wasn't accidental. I'm not here to settle that argument. I don't have the expertise or the evidence to do that honestly. What I can say, without speculation, is simpler. The buildings existed. Their proportions can be measured. Their construction techniques can be examined. The photographs were taken long before digital manipulation. The destruction is documented. Whatever name you use, these structures weren't imaginary. They stood. They were mapped. They were photographed. And then, repeatedly, they were destroyed. The label matters less than the thing it points to. Call it Tartarian architecture. Call it Old World imperial style. Call it pre-modern megalithic construction. Call it anything that lets you look at the evidence without shutting down. Because the shutdown is the real problem. Tartaria has become a thought-ending trigger. Say the word and serious discussion stops. Show the maps and people pivot away. Point to the photos and critics attack tone or motivation instead of addressing what's actually visible. That reaction is worth examining on its own. Why does a word on historical maps provoke such immediate hostility? Why does architectural analysis turn into conspiracy thinking the moment it challenges official timelines? Why does curiosity about oversized doors invite ridicule instead of investigation? Truly irrelevant questions are ignored. Questions that matter tend to be resisted. Hard. I'm not claiming Tartaria was a globe-spanning empire wiped from history by secret coordination. I don't have proof of that. What I am claiming is far more modest. The architecture shown in pre-war photographs doesn't line up cleanly with the stories we're told about who built it, when, and for whom. The destruction of that architecture follows patterns that stretch across wars, borders, and ideologies, and the reflexive dismissal of those observations is real and observable. You don't need Tartaria as a theory to accept any of that. You need photographs. You need maps. You need a willingness to notice what's there. The name is just a doorway. What matters is what's on the other side. And what's on the other side doesn't depend on terminology. It depends on whether you're willing to look. You don't have to trust me. The evidence isn't hidden. The archives are open. Anyone with an internet connection and a free afternoon can start. Pick an old map of a European city, somewhere between 1850 and 1920. Early enough to predate the wars, late enough to show detail. University libraries have digitized collections. National archives offer free access. David Rumsey's collection alone holds thousands. Find the historic core. Trace its boundaries. Notice the street patterns. The irregular medieval layouts against the later grid expansions. Watch where density tightens. That's your baseline. Then find wartime damage maps or aerial photographs from the 1940s. Many cities published them after the war. Allied reconnaissance archives are full of them. Overlay the two. Where does the destruction concentrate? Does it scatter evenly, or does it cling to the old core? Do the burn zones blur outward, or do they stop abruptly? Next, look at post-war reconstruction plans from roughly 1945 to 1965. These are often more revealing than the bombing itself. They show which streets were widened, which foundations were removed, which lines were redrawn. They show intent. Finally, look at the city today. What's still there? Basements, foundations, odd fragments embedded in modern facades. If you can, walk the streets. Notice where stonework peeks through, where doors have been shortened, where windows were filled in, where proportions were quietly corrected. This isn't abstract. It's physical. It can be measured. 4 steps, maybe 2 hours for one city, and once you do it, you'll see the pattern I couldn't unsee. You don't need credentials. You don't need permission. You don't need special access. Just curiosity and a willingness to compare what was with what remains. When you do that work yourself, you stop being an audience. You become a witness. You see why the questions matter, even if you never land on final answers. Because I don't have final answers. Not the kind that end debates and let everyone relax. What I have is clarity about where the official explanations fall short. Yes, wars hit city centers. Yes, rail lines, governments, and communications clustered there. Yes, military logic explains much of the damage. That explanation is necessary. It just isn't sufficient. It doesn't account for the precision. It doesn't explain why imprecise bombing produced such consistent outcomes. It doesn't explain why the same architectural vocabulary vanished again and again while other types survived. And it doesn't explain the rebuilding, the second blow, the deliberate removal of foundations, street plans, and memory. Wars destroy. That's what they do. But reconstruction is choice. Every widened street was a choice. Every demolished foundation was a choice. Every standardized building placed on anomalous ruins was a choice. Taken together, those choices point one way: away from the past, away from evidence, away from questions that don't fit the story we prefer to tell about ourselves. No conspiracy is required for that. No secret meetings, no hidden orders. Modern systems, economic, political, institutional, benefit from forgetting. They profit from cleared land, standardized construction, and populations that don't ask who built the buildings their grandparents photographed. When incentives align, coordination isn't necessary. The past isn't gone. The survivors prove that. Basements, foundations, fragments that escaped the burn radius, proportions that don't match. Doors sized for occupants we don't acknowledge. The evidence is buried, not destroyed, layered beneath parking garages and apartment blocks and civic centers scaled neatly to modern expectations. Beneath the streets we walk, beneath the stories we accept. Burial isn't erasure. Forgetting isn't deletion. The past waits under the surface, in archives, in photographs, in stone, waiting for someone to look. If the old city centers vanished, whether by intention or by the grinding logic of systems that benefit from forgetting, what else disappeared with them? What else did we inherit without understanding where it came from? The evidence is still there. The questions are still open. And once you see the pattern, it doesn't let you go. I didn't start this looking for conspiracies or lost empires. I was looking at buildings, just buildings, and they told a story that doesn't quite fit. Doors too tall, ceilings too high, stonework too advanced for its assigned era, infrastructure too massive for the populations we're told built it with hand tools and horses. We're allowed to marvel at ancient Egypt. We're encouraged to question how pyramids were built, but apply the same curiosity to 19th century Europe and suddenly the questions are taboo. That double standard matters. Ancient mysteries are safe. Recent ones aren't. Not because the evidence differs, but because the implications do. Ancient puzzles don't threaten modern narratives. Recent ones suggest gaps, discontinuities, forgotten chapters. And so the questions get laughed off. The photographs sit quietly in archives. The anomalies are smoothed over with language that sounds explanatory, but explains nothing. I don't know who built these structures. I don't know why they were built at that scale. I don't know why they vanish so consistently when wars provide cover. But I know the questions deserve better than dismissal. The old city centers burned. The strange architecture vanished. The rebuilding erased what the bombs missed. And we inherited cities with no memory of what stood before. But memory isn't the only record. The maps remain. The photographs remain. The fragments remain. The past is still under our feet, waiting. What you find when you start looking, and what you choose to do with it, that part is up to you. Where are you watching this video from? Tell us your city or country in the comments. We'd love to see who's joining us. Share your impressions, observations, or questions. Every comment is important. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new videos. Together, we're building a community of curious explorers.